an adjunct professor, and a specialist in sexual addiction recovery. Today, we're going to explore mental health symptomology. Please welcome Patrick Eilers. Patrick, good morning to you. Well, I should say good evening.
Yeah. Good evening. Good morning for you, Daniel. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and looking forward to our conversation. I think it's going to be really good.
My pleasure. Well, as they say on the Truman Show, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. We've got to capture them all from Taiwan all the way over to Michigan. It's a long way.
It
It's a
is.
big gap, as you were saying before. People who are travelling from Michigan all the way to Australia, it's up to about 20 hours flight time. My wife and I, we were
Absolutely.
cabin crew, and we used to work for Emirates Airline, and we were based in Dubai, and we would fly in all directions. So it might be Monday, and you might fly to Mumbai, and you'll come back. It could be Wednesday, and you're flying all the way over to Texas, and then you
Hmm.
come back to Dubai, and your circadian rhythms are all out of whack. And one of the biggest
I can imagine.
challenges was oxygen deprivation in the cabin. So you end up having very limited mental faculties. And after years of flying, what I discovered was a lot of people had mental health problems,
Hmm.
and self harm and suicidality was a major problem for cabin crew globally. And I know this is an area of specialization for you. And what I want to know, and I think a lot of other people want to know, is why would somebody speak to a professional counselor? What are some of the reasons that people typically come to speak to a counselor for?
Yeah, there's a variety of different reasons why they will. And throughout my career, depending on where you work and kind of where you're sort of settled into, it does seems to have a lot of impact on it. I mean, when you work with some type of a specialty, and in my case, I worked with a specialty working with sexual addiction recovery. Majority of those folks are coming in mainly because they've either been caught in some kind of unhealthy behavior. The unhealthy behavior is escalated to a point that they can't keep it center contained. A partner finds out about it. Those are usually kind of the main reasons why they're coming in. Usually, it's rare, but it has happened that people will come in on their own volition with those. But for the most part, it's usually because somebody has caught them, or they've kind of lost control of the behavior in some way, and they've no longer become functioning, if you want to put it that way. People who are typically outside of that, though, like more of a general practitioner, which is sort of what I am now, and sort of what I've worked in the past as, really kind of focus really on what's their symptoms. So certainly anxiety and depression are really common. People just feel like they can't kind of get past that. What they're doing or what they have been doing before is not working for them. Relationships are a big one. Certainly, kind of communication with your partner is a big one. Those are usually pretty common for people to come in for. Certainly those are kind of the main ones. I'd also say some element of it, just because of my background, there's an element of people with struggling with faith. We've had some of those. I've had worked with some of those folks, or in the same way, kind of work struggling with understanding how their faith fits in with some part of their mental health. Whether it be, like I said, anxiety, depression, or something like that. But there's different tiers, so to speak, of like severity. So again, you kind of have to consider what does that look like for most folks. And again, you may have people who have just been released from like an inpatient setting where they've been hospitalized, and their symptoms are pretty significant at that point. Or you may have people who are coming in that are kind of the everyday person, and they tend to sort of have lower symptoms, but they may be a little harder to sort of kind of get to the root cause of what's going on, that kind of thing. So there's a variety of different reasons why people come in, but those are a handful, probably the most common ones.
Take me back to the sexual addiction for a moment. Obviously, there's a journey before they speak to somebody like yourself, and mentioning here
Mhm.
that they might have been caught. When does that journey start, and what does it look like for men, and what's the difference for women if that's also a problem for them?
Mhm. Yeah, we didn't work too many, or at least I didn't, in the particular clinic that I'd worked at that time. The majority of people I worked with were guys. Probably 95 to 90%, 97% of my caseload were men. Mainly because men, again, it seems to be kind of a culturally norm that people would experience some type of sexual addiction, or at least some kind of sexual compulsive behavior, if you want to call it that, certainly within the realm of pornography is very common, especially with guys probably under the age of 40 and younger. Definitely part of their, everyone's story to some degree, learning that pornography is a way of coping skill. It's not a healthy one, but people typically will step into that. So their journeys can start, very young. I mean, from an age, 5 and up, or I mean, there's certainly, kids who have access to internet if they're not having good boundaries around the internet. I always, tell people that, our most intimate device that we have is our phone, right? Our phone goes everywhere with us. It goes to places that people cannot go to. And so when that happens, you develop this relationship with the phone. And so there's certainly an aspect of that where if you can access pornography, even at a real young age, out of curiosity, even, or maybe what your classmates told you, or whatever the case is, it starts to being, for some people, it can be that early of a journey. For other folks, it could be a little further along down the way. Certainly it could be part of their relationships when they're in college age, those kind of things. I think certainly now we're in an era where a lot of this is changing. So the traditional quote unquote person who struggles with sex addiction is not the traditional person you're going to see in 5-10 years, simply because we have AI and we have a lot of more of ways to create intimacy. And so because of that, there's a major shift in some of that for sure in that way. As far as women go, I mean, like, that looks a little different as well, though I know women's pornography use is on the rise. Typically with women, you see it more in the realm of literature. So like, 50 Shades of Grey kind of stuff, this literature kind of material. You may see it in compulsive relationships with women. They tend to sort of, not commit to one person, so to speak, but they tend to sort of, have the affair and then kind of move forward. Men do that as well. So that's not really like specific to women, but, I didn't work with a lot of women because we had other women in the office. So typically they would work with the other women, but, it is something that's on the rise for both genders. And so certainly in that idea of being able to move, closer to understanding what is healthy sex. And I think that that's really something that's changing in the culture. And like I said, a lot of that's because with so much of the access of, and we're moving away from pornography being the sort of central space. I think it's becoming more of, OnlyFans is really personalized pornography. And then really from OnlyFans, it goes into AI, it goes into robots and those kind of things. And that's even more specialized. So you start to be able to create your own fantasy, create your own intimacy. And that's just turning into yourself and not turning into other relationships. So there is a rise of that changing. Like I said, I think it'll look different for sure. Like in 10 years, there'll be a different type of, I'd say different type of sex addict, so to speak, but somebody who's struggling with it will look different than it would have, 20 years ago.
Mm. It's interesting that you say that it's going to change, because as I reflect to my younger years, I remember the guy up the street from me, he was accessing these bulletin boards. It was before like the internet, it was before Facebook, but it was a bulletin board. And I remember he had a photo of Pamela Anderson, and he showed us,
Mhm.
and I was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen anything like that before. And that was on a bulletin board. I think during those days in Australia, you might get Penthouse magazine or Playboy magazine, and you could see a little bit of skin at the local news agency, because the news agency would sell them, but the front would be covered up and you couldn't
Mhm.
open the books. So it's really hard to access. Then I traveled to the United Kingdom, probably around about 2002, 2003. And what I was shocked with was they had these page three girls. So in the local newspaper, you could buy it off the shelf, you could buy it at Sainsbury's. And when you open the first page, there's a topless woman. And it
Mhm.
was just everywhere. And so that was very
Yeah,
different from where I was coming from, where you'd have to buy
absolutely.
Playboy or Penthouse, but they were expensive. And then you get
Mhm.
over
Yep.
here and it's virtually a pound for a cheap porn newspaper.
Mhm.
But after that, it started to accelerate. I lived in the Middle East for a lot of years, and the the rule was very strict around pornography. You couldn't bring it in the country, and if you were to bring it in, it would have had to be paper based or on DVD, and it was a
Mhm.
jailable offence over there. So a lot of people
Yeah.
just said, "Well, we're not going to access it." But today, with the internet, and something you said really interesting there, that mobile device goes with you everywhere. Taking a Penthouse magazine around in your school bag wasn't an option if you got caught. But your mobile
Right.
phone, nobody's really going to grab your phone and have a look. And
Mhm.
to think that 5-year-olds can access that, that's shocking to me.
Yeah.
That is,
Yeah, well, it really is, how young your child has access, on the internet, right? That's kind of really, I mean, you can monitor some things, but there's always a chance that there's going to be something that might sneak through. It's very difficult. I mean, filters are a whole lot better than they used to be, but there's
mhm,
still not, it's not foolproof, certainly that aspect of it. Um, one of the things I'd say, and you kind of mentioned it, it is ease of access is one part of that. But I think with that ease of access is also just like we were talking about, when you had to go buy print pornography, particularly, and people talk about this. I've talked to people who are older, and that you had to get up, you had to go into the store, you had to go, try to kind of sort of be inconspicuous and get it, and those kind of things. You don't have
the
need,
heart's
yeah,
racing.
you don't need to do that now, right? You can just take the phone wherever the phone goes to the bathroom, phone goes to the bedroom. Those are two places the phone is most commonly used to act out. You go to work, same kind of thing, and people use the act out in the bathroom, that kind of thing. And the reason that is because of that intimacy with the device. And so it comes back to ease of access. If you want to remove opportunity, then it's not about whether or not you're going to come across it. It's about reducing opportunity. And it's about
Mm,
trying to find ways to reduce that intimacy with your device. That, then to me, in my opinion, that's a big part of the reason why there's this, sort of parallel between.
mm. I heard of a case many years ago, and there was a young guy, and he was in the wrong relationship, and he had got his partner pregnant, and his partner said, "Don't stay with me because you feel guilty about making me pregnant. This is not a good
Mhm.
relationship for you. It's not a good relationship for me." And she encouraged him to leave and get on with his life. It was like a get out of jail free card, but he
Yeah.
wouldn't take it. And he was working in his own yoga studio. And what he was doing was, obviously the sex had stopped in the relationship, but in his mind, he didn't want to move on. And if he moved on and found another woman, in his mind, he thought he'd be cheating on her. So what he would do is he would see a private client for yoga. He'd do his instruction. And then when the person left the studio, he would go back to the change room and masturbate. And he
Mhm.
was doing that 7 times a day. And he was
Yep.
doing that 5 days a week. And when I heard that, I was shocked. First of all, I thought, well, there's going to be no skin left on it. That's going to be very painful. But also, it
That's
must
part of it,
be
yeah, for sure.
emotionally painful to try to hide that
Mhm.
consistently. And he didn't seek any help until somebody said, and until he got caught and said, "You need help. You're doing this inside of your business. This is not good for business. You're working with female customers. This is not healthy." But in his mind, he would have continued doing that if he didn't get caught. And
Mhm.
so
Yep.
you were saying before, a lot of people don't seek help till they get caught. They're my words. Um, what prevents them from asking help? Do they realize it's a problem? Are they ashamed? Do they think that somebody's going to speak to them in a paternal type manner? What
Mhm.
prevents them from reaching out?
Yeah, probably the biggest reason, at least we would commonly see, would be shame. Again, shame versus guilt. Shame is I'm defined by this behavior. Guilt is I've done a behavior that I feel wrong about doing. And again, those can kind of cross over for a lot of folks. But shame in itself typically is a reason why people will not usually seek help. The other thing is that a lot of people don't see it as an issue. The biggest thing people like in the case of this example you just gave me, like, yeah, obviously he felt that he wasn't going to get caught, or B, he felt that there wasn't anything wrong with it. This is his way of coping with being in this relationship that, although maybe he felt obligated to be in, he obviously didn't want to be in, kind of thing. So I think there's a space where a lot of people tend to look at it as, if as long as I don't get caught, this I can justify its normality, right? Because there's kind of everywhere, like you talked about earlier, right? There's so much access to it, people don't really consider it to be an issue, especially if you're single. And a lot of times, a lot of men, particularly, they'll get used to that kind of being their lifestyle. And then when they're in a relationship, then they'll want to stop it. And that's something. And then we have had people come in and talk about that too. Like, hey, like I used to do this, I'm trying to stop it, after disclosing to their partner that they have been doing it. Now, it depends on the partner. Everybody's sort of different, but partners usually go through some type of a very similar symptoms to like PTSD, betrayal. So their betrayal is that they start to exhibit those type of symptoms when there's been a betrayal to a relationship, and this goes true for men or for women. That seems to be no matter what. And so what we see what I see in this dating culture is that there's almost an expectation that people are going to cheat on me if I'm dating them. And so because of that expectation, nobody wants to really be vulnerable. Nobody wants to turn in. Nobody's really connecting in a way that's healthy or meaningful. And so because there's an expectation that people are going to leave, that betrayal just kind of keeps on rotating through how people see women, how people see men. And then that also amplifies a lot of this behavior, because why would I want to be vulnerable with a person when I can just go over here and feel good and I don't have to be vulnerable at all, which is another major reason why people will act out. So it's kind of feeding itself in a lot of ways. And I think that social media plays a role in that too, because social media, although things may not be intended to be sexual, they become sexualized. And so you see this with like the person, hiking in the mountain. There's a beautiful mountain. All of a sudden there's a girl with yoga pants on. Now again, that's not maybe an issue for everybody, but if somebody sees that and that becomes a stimulus to kind of get them to start thinking about that, that's why they can't feel like they can escape it, because it is in a lot of different places. So there's a lot of parts it touches. I don't know if that exactly answers what you were sort of asking me in that way, but certainly it does have a lot of things that bring people to that, because they realize that it starts to surround them, right? Because they can't seem to break from the thought of it, and so all of a sudden it seems like it's just kind of closing in.
So I think what you're telling me is that those 25,000 likes aren't for that beautiful mountain range. They're for the yoga pants. Those
In a
comments
lot
from
of
the
cases, yeah.
thousands of men
Hmm.
aren't about the mountain. They're about the person
Right.
in the yoga pants. And it is interesting that, because it is everywhere. And my wife and I talk about this, and we often say that even in our field of coaching, sometimes the only thing that these new modern coaches have, some of these women, is exposing their chest. And I say to my wife, their educational content is low class, it's poor quality, but they've got a high quality chest, and that's what's getting them the likes and attention. And it's
Hmm.
interesting is
Yeah.
that the more skin they show, the more traction they get on their social media.
Yep.
And it is everywhere, that sexualized content. It's an interesting thing, because when we were growing up, we had Polaroid cameras, and each Polaroid photo was so expensive that you didn't want to waste it. If
Hmm.
you
Yep.
had to take a photo on a film camera, you had to go down to the local Kodak shop, and they were going to see your prints
Absolutely.
first of all,
Yeah.
and that was expensive, so you didn't want to waste those. But today, with the digital media, you can do so much stuff with it. My
Yeah.
brother and I, we used to own a company that produced sports videos, and when we made our first videos, it was on a traditional tape style camera. So you had to
Hmm.
record to a tape, and then you had to export that digitally, and then you had to edit it. And those cameras were around about $6,000. But today, well, even worse, when we were filming aerial content, we would have to ring my uncle and say, "Uncle, could we use the helicopter?" So he'd fuel
Hmm.
up the helicopter, you'd bring the helicopter
Yeah.
down, we'd sit in the helicopter. And it was this huge thing to get a helicopter out to get aerial content. But now anybody with a $100 drone could get
Hmm.
the exact same camera content that we were getting, spending 6,000 on a camera and hundreds of thousands
Yeah.
of dollars on a helicopter. That
Absolutely. It's
changes it so
changed
much.
dramatically
Mm.
in that sense. Yeah. Just the technology, but also the access to the technology. Again, everybody has access to a camera. Everybody has access to a phone. Pretty much everybody has access to a drone. It's
Mm.
just, again, there's some good things about that, but then there's also some negatives about that too.
There's heaps of negatives. I was walking down the river in the beautiful path going to the city. It's about a kilometre walk, and I was taking my daughter, and she was probably 8, I reckon. And my boy must have been about 4. So we're just pushing him in the pram at that stage because it was a long walk. And we stopped at the lights, and there was a girl in front of me, and she had a short skirt on. I wouldn't say a mini skirt, but a short skirt. And then there was a guy standing behind her, and he had his hand with his camera in his hand, and it was at a weird angle. And I'm thinking, why is he holding his camera down around his knee, like his phone with the camera facing up? And I thought,
Yep.
he's taking photos up her skirt. And then I saw the
Hmm.
scan. He dropped something out of his pocket, which fell between her legs, and he put the camera under her legs and took a photo.
Hmm.
And I saw him do it. and I grabbed him around the shirt. I'm big. I'm 6 foot, 105 kilos, and he was probably around
Mhm.
about 5 foot 8 and about 40 kilos. And I grabbed him by the neck and pinned him up against the telegraph post. Told the girl what happened. Took his phone and deleted everything off there. And he had obviously been doing it to a lot of women. The
Yep.
cunningness to do it publicly, where people are around. Obviously, you didn't expect to get caught by me that day, but it was that access. It was so
Hmm.
simple for him to do it.
Yep.
And I taught my children a very good lesson. I said to my daughter, make sure you're watching over your shoulder, but also a good one for my son to intervene when these things happen. Because I think today, with a lot of men, they don't intervene. They
Hmm.
just let it
Yeah.
slide because they're worried about their consequences. But at that stage, it was like, hit first, think later.
Yeah.
But it was unfair because that girl would have walked away not knowing what happened and would have been perpetrated, and the perpetrator
Hmm.
walks away with her photos.
Yeah.
That's not fair.
Yeah, and part of that, like you just talked about, that's one of those escalations, right? People start to become out of reality, and so they feel like their fantasy can, just basically be carried out. And again, that fantasy can change in different ways, and so because it comes to, a lot of times it can scare people to what they didn't think they were going to be into, because your brain is adaptable, right? And your brain changes, and your brain is, it's plastic to some degree, right? It's not
Mm,
hardwired, so people learn a lot of stuff when they watch a lot of, especially more violent porn. That certainly can escalate some of those, the ability to be able to become more the fantasy can definitely become more, you can become emboldened to do those things because you kind of need to chase sort of that high to some degree, or because it does, even if you recognize something that's, it's illegal and it's going to be something that's going to get you in trouble. You may step into it just because you can't stop your physical reactions to it. It's such a powerful thing.
mm. I want to talk about mental health symptomology. How do you describe mental health symptomology?
In like the context of diagnosis, or you talk about like, you mean like how people typically would verbalize it,
Yeah,
like in their experience?
how would you describe it in the from a not maybe not medical but a holistic health perspective, and then what are some examples of it?
Hmm. Yeah, I think symptomology. I mean, there's being human, right? And that's kind of the, I guess, from a holistic perspective. I feel like a lot of these things, emotions particularly, are part of being human. And I think that the more we try to play to the idea about getting away from emotions or ignoring emotions, or trying to suppress emotions is probably a better word. I think that starts to open that door where like you're not exposing yourself to being fully human. I think part of it is understanding that your emotions are part of you, who you are, and you may not like certain emotions and they may be distressing, but they are sort of antennas to the world. They sort of tell you what's going on around you. And so when I hear symptomologies like, anxiety is commonly referred to as, racing thoughts, elevated heart rate, feeling like your legs are wobbly, feeling like it can be dizzy, feeling like you're gonna have a hard time breathing, that kind of thing. Those are your physical body reactions, but they all start kind of back from some kind of type of an emotion, right? Could be anger, could be anxiety. Those are typically the kind of two big ones. But I think a lot of times people learn how to suppress those feelings. So again, kind of to addiction, but nearly any kind of coping skill, it's about escapism, right? It's about escaping those feelings. And those feelings can come from a variety of different places. Sometimes they can come from your experiences, your past, your childhood, whatever that might be. But if we don't learn how to be able to navigate life with those coming up like that, then we're just reinforcing more and more of that in ourselves that we don't need to deal with it, right? And they usually get worse when the more we ignore it, try to escape it. So, and like depression, an example of that one might be that, people tend to have low mood. They feel sad a lot of the time. They feel disinterested in what they used to do, what they used to like to do. They don't move around a lot. They usually become very, stationary in that way. They tend to not want to do a whole lot. They tend to oversleep or undersleep. So those are some things like physically that you might look for. But in that, depression can also then, sort of play off with anxiety. So sometimes they can kind of go hand in hand. Does anxiety mean you're going to have depression? No. If I have depression, does it mean I'm having anxiety? No. But they tend to sort of play off each other because as you don't do things in life, you become anxious about why you're not doing them, or vice versa. So a lot of these symptomologies, so to speak, kind of cross over. And so when you're looking for diagnosis, I always feel like diagnosis just explains those parts of what we just explained, right? But really healing from them is really about understanding yourself as a human being and really understanding who you are in context of those particular things happening, because they're telling us that something's going on. If you're sad about something that happened, maybe you had a loss, maybe you had a grief, maybe something happened in your life that you really need to address. And so, you need to address that if that comes up in that way, instead of trying to kind of just move on from it. And like I know in the United States, particularly, there's not a culture around how to grieve properly, right? There's a lot of grief that, like, hey, you grieve for 2 days, you had 2 days off work, now you're good, you should be able to go back to work. And grief can be a long process, sometimes all your life, sort of a processing and understanding and reevaluating and recalibrating yourself to that. So I think when you talk about symptomology, it's a little bit of that thing that you can see, but there's also a lot of it that you can't see. And so you have to kind of look at, how do I dig down? How does the therapist help me get to the point where they can help me understand more of what's behind sort of the cause of that? And again, there's a lot of things that cause that. Some of it's, it can be environment, some of it can be behavior, some of it can be how we think about things. I don't subscribe to necessarily one sort of area of psychology ever working for everybody every time. I think you have to kind of find the ones that work a little more clear with other ones, just because it allows, again, you got to be flexible. Everybody's different. You're not going to have one model that's going to work well every single time, kind of thing. So hopefully that answers kind of which question was.
I follow a guy on Instagram, and he's called the Muslim Undertaker. And that's literally what he does. He's the undertaker in Sydney. And what's interesting with the Islamic community is that within 24 hours of the death, the body is buried. And the process happens really quick.
Yeah.
My grandmother recently passed away, but from the time that she passed away to the time that she was cremated, that was probably about 9 days. And then here in Taiwan, when our grandmother passed away here, the prayers and before she was cremated was 49 days. So the process to grieve here was left open. So you could go to the funeral home, you could do your prayers. On a daily basis, we would go down there and create origami and create offerings to burn so that she could pass over into the afterlife. And that's a really communal experience here. And
Yeah.
what I found is that the grieving opportunity here is very open. So across the road from me the other day, the gentleman owned a hair salon. He passed away. They turn his shop into like a funeral home for about
Okay.
40 days. And the locals come and visit, bring offerings, the family come, and it's a public display. And the grief here is open, it's not hidden. They go
Yeah, it's
through
not
it
shameful.
as a community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful experience because you get to sit down, you get to talk, you get to eat, you get to break bread. But very quickly they seem to move on without the emotional trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Where other communities, they don't get to grieve, and like you're saying here, 2 days. Okay, we'll give you 2 days to grieve the loss of your children, your husband, your wife, and the expectation is that you turn that frown upside
Mm-hmm.
down.
Yep.
That's tough. That's tough to deal
Mm-hmm.
with. I want to
Yeah.
share some.
Yeah, and then it ends up kind of just lingering, like you said. It sounds like it's a lot easier when you have time to actually spend with, talking a lot about it, and celebration of life to some degree.
Celebration, so important. I say to people, what is it that you most loved about the departed? And they get a
Yeah.
little bit of a shock, like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you're grieving the loss, but are you celebrating the love? Are you celebrating the joy? And oftentimes they forget to do that. Here, we often talk about what we love most about the individual, what contributions they made. And it's a very different conversation at any age, but that's culturally different for us.
Yep.
I was having a look at some recent statistics, and I'll see if I can share these. Let's find them. Well, hopefully they come up. How do I get those on the screen? Oh, here we go. The World Health Organization say that there's more than 1 billion people worldwide who are living with mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. And I think this is an important number for people to know, because if you're experiencing anxiety, if you're experiencing depression, you're not alone. There's other people feeling the same way as you are. It also says here from AXA Mind Health Report, 32% of the global population reported experience mental health disorder. And among young adults, the figure rises to 44%. So if you're a young adult, you're not alone. But the global treatment gap, although over 1 billion people have a condition, most do not receive adequate care services. And I think that's a little bit frightening. There was a
Yeah.
Journal of American Medical Association report that said 97% of people who go to a hospital to get help for stress, anxiety, and depression don't get help. But the hospital system's not geared for that, in my opinion.
Hmm.
That's not what they're there for.
Yep. Yep.
There's a lot of counselors, there's a lot of psychologists out there, and I know that they want to help people, but the business of helping people is a tough business. It's an expensive business to be in. What makes it so difficult?
There's a lot of things that are part of that for sure. I mean, I guess I'll speak first to the, you said that the physical hospital is not really equipped to handle mental health, and for the most part that's true. And a lot of that's because, during the 30s and 40s, especially in the United States, like there were mental health facilities that people could go to, and that was pretty common that those would exist. But there was such a it probably happened sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. There was such a backlash of reports that came out that there was all this abuse that was going on in these facilities, and people being harmed in ways that, basically they couldn't, it made things worse for them. And a lot of times family members could be, committed, so to speak, would be a way of putting that, and they, would be able to get released and those kind of things. And there was a lot of unhealthy and unregulated things that were part of that experience. And so the government really kind of shut down almost all of those facilities during that period after the 70s. And a lot of those folks ended up getting kind of released into the general population, only to end up in the jail system, which is really kind of the United States' issue. Is that, number one, there isn't inpatient facilities that much anymore. They're very limited, and mainly because of what had happened before. And like I said, a lot of people end up in the jail system, which just isn't helpful for the jail system. So there's a lot of that certainly is part of it. From an outpatient perspective, being an outpatient therapist, the last 10 years, almost 10 years now. I think the one area I would say is, obviously there's insurance in the United States is kind of one of our biggest downfalls, is that, a lot of ways that therapists get paid is through, insurance. So basically, like, a person comes in, they get diagnosed, whatever they are, and then they reimburse. That money goes to the insurance, and then the insurance pays the therapist for doing the hour, so to speak. And there were some issues for a long time about limitations to sessions. They kind of eliminated a lot of that more, and during COVID, a lot of that stuff changed. So now it's kind of unlimited sessions now, which was a big thing. But there's that aspect of one thing, just being able to get paid through insurance. If you don't go through insurance and you pay what they call self-pay, which means to just kind of like if you went to your salon or your other type of service-based business, you go in, you basically pay a flat rate fee, and then that's for that session. And so I've worked in that setting too. In the specialty space, that's where you have to work in. Now, sessions are much more expensive than a traditional one, because insurance isn't going to cover certain addictions, but it is beneficial for the therapist, because they get the money up front, and you take a split with whoever the owner of the facility is. The downside of that for clients is that clients can't afford the money, right? So then you kind of max yourself out of people that can be generally part of your other people you could help, because they can't afford to come in for paying at a flat rate. So for me, one of the things I think, kind of going back to where my business, or my side project business now is sort of really addressing is not so much necessarily that financial component. I mean, that is kind of that's kind of just the nature of the business right now, unfortunately. And unless there's our legislation in place to change that, we're kind of, that's kind of what we have to work with. But what my experience has been is that a lot of mental health facilities, the practices themselves, really do not have good cultures. A lot of the cultures of the practices, meaning it's the owner to the therapist, or the group of therapists together, however you want to word that, that internal place is not always a very healthy place for the therapist. So a lot of therapists don't necessarily look to and go into a practice with the intention that they're going to be there for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years and really build into their caseload of that community that they're part of. They look basically to get to a point where they can find the next best thing, and then they end up leaving. And so, or starting their own practice, and then it basically becomes kind of splintered, where you have all these people going different directions. And so what ends up happening is the strength of the entire field is suffering from the lack of having healthy culture. And really that starts with owners being able to get away from dual role, which is something that I think is, to me, it's hard to do that, because as an owner, you're still going to have a role as an owner and a therapist, but there's very little evidence throughout any other professional fields that, I use professional sports as the example, but whether it be in football, my example was car racing. During the 90s, there was a handful of guys like in NASCAR that were like in the middle of their career or toward the end of their career trying to be owners and drivers. They tried to buy all their own equipment, drive their own cars, hire all their guys, and their performance dropped way off because they couldn't. And when they were asked why that work was the way it was, they said they couldn't get out of the headspace of, knowing that if they crashed the car, they were going to have to pay the money, right? If you're driving somebody else's car, it doesn't really much matter to whether or not you crash it, right? So that's very much the same kind of thing that happens with owners and therapists. Like, if you're an owner and a therapist, it tends to be that you sort of, I'm doing my thing and I'm expecting the people I'm handling to do their thing. And there's a lack of cohesion in the vision. There's a lack of sort of the hiring people that match the vision that you have as an owner. And a lot of this kind of started for me was when I read Simon Sinek's book, What's Your Why? And a lot of that's got to do with a lot of these practices don't know what their why is. What are you trying to actually really accomplish here besides offering, quality mental health services? What's your population? How are you going to do that? Who are you hiring to represent that? And a lot of that stems back to some things in the school system within mental health, at least in America. When you're in your master's program, they kind of teach you how to run a therapy session, and they teach you how to be a therapist, and they teach you all those kind of things, but they don't teach you how to be a business owner. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll take a lot of their therapeutic knowledge that they have, which can be very extensive depending on how long they've been doing it, and they try to apply that to the business, and that doesn't work, because business, from what I've learned over the last year, is like business acumen or business knowledge that's out there is all geared toward, a sales, kind of like a sales pitch or a sales-centered idea. Well, a practice is not a sales-centered organization. You can't strike when the iron's hot. If you do, you're going to force people away. You're going to hire people that aren't going to be a good fit for your culture. So really what ends up happening, I think, is that the whole practice in general, the businesses of mental health, the people who own those practices, it just becomes overwhelming. And so there's a lot of people who, they end up taking on way too much stuff because they're not finding the right people for so their organization can thrive. And so because of that dual role, some of it's logistics, but most of it is relating to how do you find the people who are going to fit with what you want to do. And then, then you can factor in all the other stuff with the the money and those kind of things that we just talked about earlier as being issues. But I think those can probably be rectified if people would have better cultures within the mental health practices. If the practices are strong and the therapists want to come to work and the therapists enjoy that culture, they feel supported, they're going to want to help the people that they're with. I mean, I've never really met too many therapists who don't want to help people. It's just, can they help people with the support of other therapists? They need that because it's a tough job to do it every day. So that's one of the things, in my opinion, that the places are lacking. And so that's kind of where my business is really, the idea of it was really about consulting with owners, how to make your practice more sustainable in that way, not necessarily financially. Now, your financial parts will come with that if you can maintain your therapists, because the research is, at least in Michigan, they did some research a couple of years ago, that it costs anywhere between $7,000 and $65,000 to re-onboard a new therapist every time you have to hire somebody. And people don't think anything of it, but if they're 40% turnover rate, which is what most therapist practices in Michigan are, you're looking at, you're hiring probably a new therapist every other year at that, probably even more than that. And so what ends up happening is you're losing up to $65,000 every time you do that. So really the main issue is, can we get these practices to be more cohesive and can be stronger in their populations and actually work off one another so that they can be able to help the overall population of mental health clients in that way. So that's kind of where I see is some of the things that come up, and that's really where the business part came in for me, was trying to help those owners in that way and try to find some cohesion there.
And that loss doesn't show up on the profit and loss statement. It's all a sunk cost. And the average business, when they do a mishire, it costs between about 5 to 6 times the person's annual salary. So it's even higher because we have the time that position's been vacant. We have the time in training and all the other people's hours to bring them up to speed on the onboarding. And then after that, we have the downtime as they go through that learning curve. And I've seen it in businesses in Australia that the cost of a mishire can be anywhere from $500,000 to $600,000 impact to the business. When you zoom out and you have a look at everything and how it's been impacted, it's a huge cost.
Yep.
And that number of 40%, most business owners tell me, they say, Daniel, it's like the flip of a coin. If I call the heads, I might get a tail, and that's about how good my strike rate is with employing people. And that's from their side, but also the person who's being onboarded. Majority of people, I think it's around about 80%, complain about the onboarding. So they've been hired, they're excited to work for the company. They come in and the onboarding process is horrible. And they say, I can't believe what I've signed up for.
Yep.
And through my research is that the majority of decisions to leave are made in the first 24 hours of somebody joining your business. And I think if that problem can be solved for a business owner, that's a big help, because you can't be strong in all areas. It was like in aviation. The pilot flew the aircraft. The pilot didn't run the air traffic control. The pilot didn't refuel the aircraft. The pilot didn't serve the meals. The pilot's not washing the aircraft. The pilot's not changing the tires. The pilot's job is just to fly the aircraft and then to build a team around the pilot to make it happen. But you can't mix those psychologies. I know from my business as a coach, I've got to be able to sell. I've then got to be able to coach. I've then got to be able to steer the business. And those three things require a different type of psychology. And if you go into a coaching or a counseling session with a sales psychology, the patient or the client feels it. They're saying, am I going to be sold to? What's the upsell? Are you here to listen and to serve, or are you trying to sell me into the next session? And that's unfair for the customer, because they can feel it. When you walk into a car dealership, they ask you these loaded questions, and you can just see this big red sign across the salesperson's head: sell, sell, sell. And it turns off every buyer. It's not how people want to be treated. And it's a tough thing to run a business. What do you think is the thing that keeps them up at night most, these business owners? What keeps them awake?
Yeah, and that's a question that, I was asked very early on when I started trying to explore it. What was I trying to meet the need there? And to me, there, one of the things hard about it as a clinician, you see this with other clinicians too, is that they tend to, it's always kind of like it's somebody else's practice that's got the issue, right? It's not yours. So a lot of it is really like trying to help people understand that what keeps you up at night is going to be all the things that you are trying to control to some degree. Whether or not how much money you're bringing in, obviously your particular people that you do hire. So I do think there are some things that are like, for a lot of business owners, at least as a clinician, at least from my experience as an employee, there were the things that kind of kept people up were really about, focusing on too much about how the business was consuming the rest of their life. And I had experienced this as an owner too. Like, when you have a minute of downtime, rather than learning how to, break that time about, to yourself versus to your business, you end up giving it over to the business. And that's really where, from a therapist perspective, that ends up really harming you as a clinician, because you're not going to be able to do the kind of work you're able to do when you're focusing solely on the business versus the people that are coming in to see you. And that's one of the things where I feel like if you're going to dual role, your reduction of your clientele needs to be significant. I mean, more than just 5 sessions. I mean, it's got to be cut probably in half or more, just so you can be able to have that role of also being an owner and making sure the business is healthy. And usually it's flipped the other way around. Usually the owners will, they'll see the most people because they want to generate the most income. and then they'll leave the scraps of the time left over to the business. Well, then the business suffers because the business doesn't have clear roles, doesn't have clear vision, doesn't have a clear direction. People are making decisions that are not aligned with what the company is trying to, or the vision of the practice is supposed to be. So you see a lot of that where, like that time distribution is really off, and then they end up suffering because they get overwhelmed. And now they're in a position where they're feeling that they're underwater because they can't, move forward, but they're not willing to reach out to, fix it, because it almost feels like it's only going to take the next decision they're going to make before it kind of starts to settle down. And that's more of like the mentality of when you have a caseload that gets overwhelming. One of the things I've seen more recently is that people will tend to hire more therapists because they have a wait list, which in itself is not a bad idea. But the thing is, if you only got 5 people on a case on your wait list, and you hire 5 therapists, those 5 people aren't going to be there by the time those are 5 therapists get on board. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things, is then you have a wait list of clinicians. You don't have a wait list of clients. And so then what ends up happening is it's just sort of clinicians on standby, which is sort of kind of something that with like these online companies, Better Health or BetterHelp, Headway, some of these are online companies. That's kind of their mentality is, basically hire as many clinicians as we can, and eventually the people will be there. Well, there's no guarantee that those people are going to be there. And you saw just from those statistics you showed earlier that, there's a lot of people who might be suffering, but that doesn't mean there's a lot of people seeking help. And so that's another part of it is like, you might have all the clinicians in the world, but if you don't have the people coming in to see those clinicians, then your business is going to suffer, because you're either, in a lot of cases, you don't pay people if they're contractors because, you don't need to unless they see someone. But in a lot of cases, you're gonna basically be waiting for those people for a long period of time until you can fill them up.
One thing I've seen over the years in business coaching is that people attempt to build the business based on their needs, and they forget that the business serves the customer.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to therapy, and my own personal experience as a customer, I want to build a relationship with my counselor, my coach, my psychologist. I want them to understand my personal history, because the last thing I want to do is to have to repeat myself to somebody new over and over and over again, because I feel that I'm not progressing. I keep going back to the start, not because of me, but because of the system. I want continuation. I have
continuity is huge.
So important. One of my coaches that I work with, I hired him in 2016. I had my most recent session with him last week, but he understands my journey. So when I catch up with him, I don't have to go back and do a detailed personal history every single time. I've got that. I've had other people who were very good at the sales process. So I went through their sales funnel. It's me selling to them on why they should coach me. Then I paid them my $2,500 for a session. And I get there and that person feels like a rock star. I'll tell you what happened. I paid the money in advance and I show up to the session and it's on the iPhone. They're hanging out in the backyard of their house smoking a cigarette, and I've just paid $2,000 US for a session with them. And I thought, who's this about? Is this about them, which it was, or is it about me? And afterwards, they said, "Oh, you don't have a problem." I said, "Thank you so much. I know I have a problem because I've been dealing with it every day. But thanks for wasting my time and my money." And that was a company that was really good at the sales process, but they didn't have the service delivery. And so immediately, I'd probably already spent in excess of $20,000 with them on other products. And I'm like, well, there's no more money for you. I'm not going to allocate any more money from my company to yours because you let me down when I needed it the most.
Right. Absolutely.
I don't want a therapist smoking cigarettes whilst I'm talking to them about intimate issues. I need your full attention, not you rolling your cigarette.
Well, and you got to have professionalism, and none of that says anything about being professional. And when you have something like that, it's just and sometimes there's clinicians that there are some that want to have more casual encounters, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's got to be within parameters of professionalism, and that would definitely not be one of them. If they're smoking a cigarette, it certainly wouldn't be in that realm for sure.
On my $2,000 check,
for $2,000, sure.
Everybody knows that to spend $2,000, you can't just make $2,000. If you're a business owner and you're doing well and you've got between 20 to 30% profit margins, you probably had to bring in $6,000 to $8,000 worth of income to your business to allocate that 2,000. So it's not the
Mhm.
2,000, it's everything you had to do to get to that.
Yeah.
And even
Yeah,
for me,
definitely.
after I had that experience, I was like, you know what? I might just try to fix it myself. If that's the best in the business and that's how I'm treated, I may as well just go back inside
Yep.
and hide it. And I'm
And
sure
that's
that's
another
something
good
that can
point
work.
because that happens a lot too. Yeah, people won't return if they have really bad therapy experiences, and that goes back to those statistics. I mean, that's a big part of it. I think people who've made efforts. I've heard a lot of, I've heard some good stories, but I've heard a lot of bad stories of people's experiences and why they didn't go back to therapy because, or been many years since they've been to therapy because they've had a negative experience, and that's another thing. Like the field as a whole has to do better in that sense. And that's about, like we just were talking about, like it's about being professional, it's about having the vision, it's about knowing what you have to do and taking it seriously and hiring the people that are going to reflect that. If you don't ask the right questions, you're never going to get the right people to be able to be, part of your vision, but you got to know as the owner what that looks like. And if you don't, then yeah, you're going to have a lot of people that aren't going to fit what you want to do.
Brian Tracy, great author in America, he says that 95% of your business success is going to be able to recruit and retain top talent.
Yep.
And I think if business owners realize that that's a skill that can be learned, then at least their mind should be open to the opportunity to become a student again. Okay, well, if other people are learning how to do it, I can learn how to do it.
Yeah.
And with services like you can just accelerate that process for them because when it comes to hiring, we can't learn by mistake. Like you said before, if it costs you $40,000, nobody wants to make a $40,000 error. Why not get some good advice,
hmm Yeah.
pay for the advice up front, and save yourself a mistake immediately? Because you can hire a rock star in hiring people who are in high complex jobs and high skilled jobs. A top performer is 800% more effective than a poor performer.
Mm.
And people say, well, I got to pay 800% more. No, you don't have to pay the high performer 800% more. Oftentimes you pay them the same rates, but the return is greater. They don't make the
Yep.
mistakes. You've got to vet them. You've got to understand who they are. And in a business, your culture is your asset. And if they fit your culture, then your asset value increases.
hmm
But one bad apple amongst the batch can kill your culture.
Yep.
And then you get
Absolutely.
all your silent quitters. They
Yeah.
silently quit.
Or
And it's
or they just basically they'll stay for by the time you get halfway through the onboarding, then they'll be out, and that's I've seen that a lot too, where they'll hire a therapist and they're hoping it's going to work out, but they never really know, and they guarantee something that they can't guarantee, and then the person leaves because before they even finish their onboarding process because it doesn't fit, and now again some of that is the person interviewing, but also it's the company that's interviewing them. Like there needs to be more questions that are specifically geared toward what they're looking for. And I think a lot of times, a lot of interviews with mental health basically go back to, do you have a license? What kind of modalities do you use? What's your been your retention rate? And, are you any good with, this area? What population do you work with? And that's about as far as those questions usually typically go. And then the idea is, well, you can figure out, you're a professional, you'll be able to do all the rest of it yourself. And it's like, well, maybe, but at the same time, if I've worked with a group of people that don't really feel like I'm really that support or I'm really, part of this team, I'm probably not going to stay around just because even if I make more money, I'm not going to, that's an important, for me personally, that would be an important thing. It might depend on the person, but if they find that to be something that's important, they're not going to stay there because they're not supported in a way that, makes them part of the organization and the vision together. So that's a big part of that.
mm. When I'm working with my clients and we're hiring, we say that past performance predicts future performance. And if somebody
Mhm.
has a really good track record, that's a great place to start. They can prove competence. But in the interviewing process, we like to say hire slow
Mhm.
and fire fast. So we go through the hiring process and we do it really slowly. We want to get really thorough. We want to make sure that this person really wants to work with this business more than any other business. And if they're just here applying for another job and going to another 10 places, chances are they're not a great candidate because they have to want to be on this team. They have to want to be part of this business. They have to want to serve this particular customer.
Yep.
And when we slow down through that process, we start to see the different layers of the people. And we have this called a rule. We call it the rule of three. First of all, we interview them in the business, and we get a snapshot of what the character looks like when everything's on show. It's like the first
Yep.
date. Everything's great. It's the honeymoon. Then the second time we interview them, we take them to a different location, oftentimes a cafe. And when we go to a cafe, what we're doing is we're assessing how they interact socially. When
Hmm.
they order a coffee, how do they treat the barista? When somebody comes and serves them their cake, how do they treat that person? And that gives a big insight into the individually socially. And then what we do is we get three people to interview them because each time they start to peel back another layer. And if that person's consistent from start to finish, oftentimes that's a very good sign that this person's going to stay with the business and
Hmm.
be a top performer. But if they're showing different personality traits to different people at different times and they're inconsistent,
Yep.
we know we're going to absorb that into the business and that's not going to work. And it's amazing what different people discover. I was doing a recruitment interview and the person had already been through the first two stages. And so they started to relax, they started to assume that the job was in the bag. And we did in the Zoom interview, they showed up, hooded jumper, they showed up late, they'd slept in that morning. And the first thing that I found was when they hopped on the Zoom call, they just sucked on the vape and blew the smoke over the camera.
Mm.
And I thought, what an interesting opening. You know, if I'm part of the business and this is how they're presenting themselves to me, how are they going to present themselves to the customer? And as we got talking, all the bad habits came out, the drug use, the bad habits, the criminal record.
Yeah.
And I messaged the business owner. I said, "Did you know this, and this?" And they said, "No, we didn't, but it's too late." I said, "What do you mean it's too late?" They said, "We've already sent them the letter of offer and acceptance." I said, "No, call it back." But it was just by going slow. So
Yeah.
hire slow and fire fast.
Hmm.
And they did the right
Yeah.
thing and they didn't let that person in the business and they let them go and ruin somebody else's business. So hiring is ultimately important.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What what do you see taking place uh, in the changing world? More people operating online, obviously seeking counselling online. What do you see for the future of counselling? Is it going to be online, offline? Is it going to be hybrid of both?
Well, hybrid right now is kind of I would say, the standard to some degree. I've run into a lot of people over the last probably year that have wanted to do only in person. So I think there's more people more clients want to do it in person, more counselors want to do it virtually. Not quite exactly sure why that is, but I have my theories. But I think part of my guess would be is because the clinicians like a little bit of that. They like the space from the perspective of, I think, just kind of being able to just jump into a session and jump out of a session and being at home and that kind of thing. I can see some pros and cons to it, but I think for me personally, I like to do them in person because you get a different sense of a person than you do when you're through virtual. Not that virtual is bad, because it certainly has a lot of wonderful. Obviously we're talking, literally across the world from one another, and we're having this opportunity. So there's definitely some benefits from it. But when you're talking about, really emotional things, and you're having, especially when you do, like, trauma work with EMDR and those kind of things, I think there's a huge benefit to being in person. I think there'll obviously be a continuation of the online world and the online virtual therapy, because a lot of people see it as a cost effective alternative and a way that more people can get services. And in some cases, that probably is true. In other cases, I don't know if it's always ideal. But again, that's kind of where we're at. I think we've kind of landed at that point. So, um, excuse me. That also goes back to, like, physical things as well, though, too. I mean, there's a lot of physical doctor's appointments that are online as well. So, um, yeah, I think it's kind of here to stay. I don't think it's going to be changing anytime soon, but I do think, being in person has a huge advantage. And if you can be in person, I think that's something to definitely consider before you do
Mhm.
virtual. Virtual being like your second option.
Mm. From my experience, when I was seeing people in person, it was very difficult because my business didn't have a geographical strategy.
Mm-hmm.
There was no 10-kilometre catchment area. My clients could come from North Sydney, South Sydney, Western Sydney. And the biggest challenge for me was the financial cost. I could drive to the southern part of Sydney and it'd take me an hour to get there, but the
Mm-hmm.
client didn't want to pay the hour transportation. I'd see them in person, then I'd have to drive north another hour to see another client. Then I'd have to drive west another hour. And most of my day was spent traveling. And it was difficult to make the business profitable because the sheer cost of
Yep.
travel. My accountant, now, if I go back 20 years ago, my accountant said, Daniel, if you're driving your vehicle, it's $1 per kilometre. So I was calculating 15 years ago that I could spend up to $300 a day just on travel. That didn't account for my time or
Mm-hmm.
lost
Yeah.
opportunity. And I found that really, really challenging. So I moved to online, but I also got talking to a lot of other coaches and therapists. And I said, why are you moving offline to online? And they started to talk about absorbed emotions. And they said that when they were doing their in person appointments, if they were a really highly sensitive person, they tended to absorb a lot of the emotion
Okay.
and they started to have their own physical and emotional challenges because they were
Mm-hmm.
absorbing so much. For those highly sensitive people, once they started to work online, the internet kind of gave them a bit of a barrier.
Yeah.
It gave them a bit of a shield that they didn't have to carry the weight of the traumas, especially when there was a lot of content involved. They could deal with the content, but the emotions that were absorbed face to face were too tough.
Yeah.
And so I've had that personal experience myself. I've also found the opposite is during the pandemic, we were doing some really big group trainings and we would get up to 500 people at a time coming through our 3-day program. And what I found was that at some of the stages where we were doing emotional release techniques, it was like the internet amplified the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And how I would describe it is in front of me here, I've got a 49-inch monitor. But during the pandemic, I had two 49-inch monitors. So I could see up to 200 faces at a time. And I could calibrate on 200 people going through emotional releases. And I was absorbing 200 different feelings at a time. And
Yeah.
that was
Well,
really overwhelming for me. It was
absolutely.
really overwhelming for my technology as well, because at 2 p.m. every Saturday, my computer crashed. It crashed when I was doing the same NLP technique every Saturday at 2 p.m. and it crashed. And my wife said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "I don't know." And I reached out to my mate, Vince, who was my business partner. And I said, "What's happening?" He said, "The internet is amplifying the emotion." And he said, "It's getting
Mm.
channeled into your technology." Other people might call it Mercury in retrograde when the planet Mercury
Okay. Yeah.
gets into a certain position or the full moon. But I've had that feeling and it's
Mm.
one of those things you got to navigate. You got to figure it out. What do you like?
Yeah.
What works for you?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. There's a lot of that, learning how to be able to separate yourself from that. And that's definitely a therapeutic skill, or as a coach as well, certainly being able to, not take all of that on. And it does get challenging sometimes to have that separation.
it is a challenge. It is a challenge. I struggle with um, sentimental stress. And
Mm.
sentimental stress, the way that I describe it, is I take other people's problems on board because as a coach, I'm on the journey with them. I experience their highs, I experience their lows.
Yeah.
When they quit, I feel it. And I've had to learn to manage that over the years. So I don't take it too personally. It's what makes me great because I'm so invested into the relationship,
Hmm.
but it's what also limits me over time because I do get so emotional about it. Where I've
Yep.
got other friends who are really logically stressed and they say, I don't feel any of that. I don't
Hmm.
experience any of that.
Yeah.
Let me borrow that type of logical stress for a day.
Yeah, it's like the difference between being like a really very technical therapist versus like an emotional experience type of thing, and that's kind of what you're describing is that like being able to connect with emotionally
Mm.
is draining in its own way and and certainly in a way that I've had some similar experiences too. You get invested in people emotionally and you want to see their success, On the other side of it, the technical therapist is really good at like giving, very, good techniques and good ways to be able to navigate some different things, but they don't always have the same kind of connection. And so there's certain clients that won't find that to be as helpful because they will feel a little bit disconnected from that. So, so there's a little bit of a balance to both in order to kind of be, have the success that you're looking for in that way. But that's a lot of life is balance, is trying to find balance in all things.
So much to learn. For people who want to learn how to build a better business, where can they find you?
So my website is a Patreon channel that I have all of my content on there. Patreon.com/Bloomworks, one word. You can also email me at bloomworkscc@gmx.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, Patrick Eilers, MALPC. I think if you put like the Bloomworks, it'll come up in there as well. So yeah, so those are some ways you can get a hold of me.
Wonderful. Patrick, thanks for joining us and sharing your wisdom. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it. It was a really good conversation.
Thank you.